On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic departed Southampton, England, on her maiden voyage, carrying over 2,200 passengers and crew across the North Atlantic toward New York City. At the time of her launch, the Titanic represented the absolute pinnacle of early 20th century maritime engineering and luxury. Built by the White Star Line at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, the ship measured over 269 meters in length, making her, at the time, the largest moving man-made object ever constructed. Her design incorporated 16 watertight compartments, separated by doors that could be closed remotely from the bridge, a safety feature that contributed significantly to the ship's popular reputation, promoted heavily by contemporary press coverage, as being effectively unsinkable. A claim that was somewhat exaggerated by period journalism beyond what White Star Line's own engineers had actually claimed, though the phrase nonetheless became firmly attached to the ship's public identity well before she ever left port. The ship's passenger accommodations reflected the genuinely stark class divisions characteristic of early 20th century society. First-class passengers enjoyed accommodations considered genuinely luxurious, including an elaborate grand staircase, a heated swimming pool, and dining room serving elaborate multi-course meals prepared by an extensive kitchen staff. Wealthy passengers in elaborate Edwardian fashion, silk dresses, and tailored suits walked the promenade decks with poise. Second-class accommodations, while considerably more modest, still offered genuinely comfortable travel considerably above typical contemporary standards. Third-class passengers, including many emigrants seeking new opportunities, occupied more basic accommodations located in the ship's lower decks, though even these quarters were generally considered reasonably comfortable compared to typical third-class conditions on other ocean liners. As the Titanic departed Southampton, made a brief stop in Cherbourg, France, and a final stop in Queenstown, Ireland, few aboard could have genuinely anticipated that this celebrated maiden voyage would become one of history's most studied maritime disasters. Among the passengers boarding was John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men in America, alongside several hundred emigrants in third class seeking new lives and economic opportunity in the United States, representing the diverse cross-section of society that would, within days, share an identical fate aboard the same vessel. For the first several days of her voyage, the Titanic proceeded smoothly across the North Atlantic, enjoying a pleasant and uneventful ocean crossing. First-class passengers occupied their days with formal dining and socializing in elegantly appointed lounges, or exercising in the ship's gymnasium and swimming pool. Elaborate multi-course dinners served in the dining saloon reflected the culinary sophistication the White Star Line offered its wealthiest passengers as a central luxury. Third-class passengers, while in more modest accommodations, enjoyed comfortable communal spaces and meals that were often superior to their typical daily diet at home. A sense of communal camaraderie developed among them, drawn from diverse backgrounds, but united by shared hope for new opportunity awaiting in the United States. The ship's crew of nearly 900 maintained the vessel's operation, from officers overseeing navigation to engineering staff managing the massive coal-fired boilers. This considerable crew reflects the operational complexity required to safely and comfortably transport such an enormous number of passengers across the open Atlantic. By the evening of April 14th, Captain Edward Smith oversaw a ship that had experienced an entirely uneventful and successful maiden crossing. Deep within the lower decks, the engineering department maintained continuous operation of the massive boilers that powered the Titanic's engines at an impressive speed. This demanding and physically taxing occupation required skilled labor to sustain the crossing, working in conditions far less glamorous than the elegant spaces above. Many engineering crew members would later remain at their posts to maintain power for as long as possible, even as flooding worsened around them. Throughout April 14, 1912, the Titanic's wireless operators received numerous ice warnings from other ships operating in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, messages that, in hindsight, historians considered genuinely significant, though their handling reflects broader period limitations in wireless communication protocol and prioritization. Several ships, including the Coronia, the Baltic, and notably the Californian, transmitted messages throughout the day reporting significant ice directly in the Titanic's route. Some warnings reached the bridge and were acknowledged, while one transmitted by the Californian later that evening appears to have been delayed or deprioritized. The wireless operators were dealing with a considerable backlog of passenger personal messages requiring transmission through the ship's Marconi wireless system. In 1912, wireless technology was young, and formal protocols regarding prioritizing navigational safety over personal correspondence were considerably less developed. The Titanic disaster prompted significant subsequent reform in maritime communication procedure, specifically informed by lessons learned from this exact breakdown. Despite receiving multiple warnings, the Titanic maintained her speed at approximately 22 knots as she proceeded through the shipping lanes that evening. Maintaining scheduled speed despite ice warnings was not considered unusual then, though investigation later identified this as a significant contributing factor. As night fell, the sea remained remarkably calm, with clear visibility, but no moon to illuminate the water ahead. This unusually calm sea state, while pleasant for passengers, actually presented a genuine additional hazard specifically related to iceberg detection. Normally, waves breaking against an iceberg's base create visible white foam. The flat water that night eliminated this visual aid entirely. Lookouts relied on spotting a dark silhouette against the night sky, a difficult task that historians identify as a significant environmental factor. At approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, lookout Frederick Fleet, stationed in the ship's crow's nest, spotted an iceberg directly ahead of the Titanic's path and immediately alerted the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch, upon receiving this warning, ordered the ship's engines reversed and the helm turned, in an attempt to avoid direct collision. Despite this response, the Titanic's considerable size and momentum made an immediate course change genuinely difficult to achieve within the limited available time, and the ship's starboard side scraped along the iceberg's submerged portion, an impact that, according to numerous surviving passenger accounts, felt surprisingly minor at the time, with many passengers reporting only a slight shudder or grinding sensation, rather than any dramatic, violent collision. This relatively minor feeling impact, however, masked genuinely catastrophic underlying damage. The iceberg's collision breached the ship's hull along a considerable length, allowing water to flood into several of the 16 watertight compartments simultaneously. While the ship's watertight compartment design could successfully keep the vessel afloat with up to 4 compartments fully flooded, the iceberg collision had breached enough compartments, historians generally agree around 5 or 6, to exceed this critical safety threshold, making the ship's eventual sinking essentially unavoidable. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer who was traveling aboard for this maiden voyage, specifically to observe the vessel's performance, was summoned to assess the damage shortly after the collision. According to surviving testimony, Andrews quickly recognized the genuinely catastrophic nature of the damage and reportedly informed Captain Smith that the ship's sinking was now a mathematical certainty, estimating the vessel had perhaps 1 to 2 hours remaining before going down. A genuinely sobering assessment that set in motion the ship's emergency evacuation procedures. Andrews's specific technical expertise regarding the ship's design proved genuinely crucial during this initial assessment period, since his direct, detailed knowledge of exactly how the watertight compartment system functioned allowed him to calculate the ship's fate with a level of grim mathematical precision that other officers present, however experienced in general seamanship, likely could not have independently determined with comparable speed and accuracy during those critical early minutes following the collision. In the immediate aftermath of Thomas Andrews's damage assessment, Captain Smith faced an almost impossible situation. A ship carrying over 2,200 people, but equipped with lifeboat capacity for barely half that number. This critical lifeboat shortage reflected contemporary maritime regulation, rather than any specific failure unique to the Titanic herself. Existing British Board of Trade regulations governing lifeboat capacity had not been updated to account for the increased size of ocean liners. They based required lifeboat capacity on a ship's overall tonnage, using outdated calculation methods that had not kept pace with modern design. The Titanic actually carried slightly more lifeboats than the minimum requirement, a detail that provided little comfort given the enormous gap in capacity. As officers began preparing lifeboats for launch, considerable initial confusion and delay characterized the early evacuation process. Surviving accounts describe passenger reluctance to board lifeboats, since the ship showed few immediately obvious signs of catastrophic flooding. The flooding was occurring deep within her lower decks, hidden from the view of those on the upper decks. Several of the earliest lifeboats launched departed the ship carrying considerably fewer passengers than their full-rated capacity. This decision was identified as a significant, tragic factor to the disaster's severe death toll, as these boats represented lost capacity. Officers and passengers had not yet fully appreciated the ship's true, rapidly worsening situation. The ship's wireless operators, meanwhile, began transmitting distress signals, including the newly adopted international call, SOS. They also sent the traditional CQD signal, reaching several vessels that were positioned too distant to arrive in time. The RMS Carpathia received the call and immediately began steaming toward the Titanic's reported position at maximum speed. Aboard the Titanic, officers worked to organize an evacuation for which neither passengers nor crew had received adequate preparation. Notably, a planned lifeboat safety drill had been scheduled for earlier that voyage, but was ultimately canceled by Captain Smith. This cancellation may have contributed to the genuine confusion and inefficiency that characterized the earliest stages of the loading process. As lifeboat evacuation proceeded through the night's increasingly desperate hours, ship's officers generally enforced a policy prioritizing women and children for available lifeboat seats. This was a maritime tradition with established historical precedent, though its actual implementation aboard the Titanic varied somewhat between different sections of the ship. Surviving statistical analysis of the disaster's final casualty figures reveals genuinely significant disparities in survival rates correlating with both gender and passenger class. First-class female passengers experienced a survival rate exceeding 90%, while third-class male passengers experienced a survival rate below 20%. Historians attribute this to several compounding factors, including the policy itself and the physical location of third-class accommodations distant from the boat deck. According to surviving testimony, inconsistent access restrictions limited some third-class passengers' ability to reach the boat deck during the critical early evacuation period. Subsequent formal inquiry into the disaster, conducted separately by both British and American investigative bodies, examined these class-based survival disparities in considerable detail. While historians continue debating the extent of deliberate restriction, the documented statistical disparity itself remains a matter of clear historical record. Individual accounts of remarkable courage and self-sacrifice emerged. Isidore and Ida Strauss, an elderly first-class couple, reportedly declined an offered opportunity to board. Ida chose to remain with her husband rather than separate, both ultimately perishing together aboard the ship. This story reflects the genuine range of human response to catastrophic, life-threatening circumstances during the disaster's final moments. White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay ultimately survived by boarding one of the final lifeboats launched from the ship. His decision would subject him to considerable, sustained public criticism and scrutiny in the disaster's aftermath. Observers felt his position as a senior official should have obligated him toward greater self-sacrifice, comparable to the ship's officers and crew. This controversy reflects broader period social expectations regarding class, gender, and duty that shaped contemporary public reaction to individual survival decisions. As the night progressed and the Titanic's bow continued sinking progressively deeper into the North Atlantic waters, conditions aboard the ship grew increasingly desperate, with the vessel's severe forward tilt becoming genuinely, visibly apparent to those still aboard by approximately 1:30 a.m. The ship's musicians, a group of 8 professional musicians led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley, continued playing throughout much of the evacuation period, a widely documented act of remarkable composure that numerous surviving accounts specifically credit with helping maintain a degree of calm among passengers. All 8 musicians ultimately perished in the disaster, their sustained performance becoming one of the most frequently referenced individual acts of courage. By approximately 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat had been launched, leaving well over 1,000 passengers and crew still aboard the rapidly sinking vessel. With the ship's angle growing increasingly steep, as her flooded bow continued pulling the forward sections of the ship progressively deeper beneath the surface. Surviving accounts from lifeboats describe harrowing final scenes, including passengers and crew gathering on the increasingly tilted stern section as the final moments approached. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the ship's lights, which had remained illuminated through the operation of the engineering crew, finally failed, plunging the scene into darkness. Marine engineers conclude the ship likely broke into 2 major sections around this time, with severe structural stress exceeding the hull's structural integrity. The engineering crew's sustained effort to maintain electrical power throughout much of the sinking represents one of the disaster's most significant acts of collective courage. This continued illumination assisted the evacuation by providing crucial visibility for passengers navigating tilted decks and crew members working to launch the remaining lifeboats. Historians identify this contribution as having likely saved additional lives, even as the engineering crew remained in an increasingly perilous position deep within the ship. At approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic completed her final descent beneath the North Atlantic. This occurred roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes after her collision with the iceberg. For those who had not secured a place in the ship's limited lifeboats, the freezing North Atlantic water presented an almost immediately fatal circumstance. Medical understanding confirms survival time in water. This cold measures only in minutes, leading to rapid onset of hypothermia regardless of physical fitness. Survivors in nearby lifeboats faced genuinely difficult decisions, with some boats launched significantly under their full passenger capacity. They faced the agonizing choice of whether to return toward the wreck site to attempt rescuing additional people from the freezing water. This was complicated by fear that desperate swimmers might attempt to climb aboard in such numbers as to capsize the rescuing lifeboat itself. Tragically, most survivors in the water succumbed to hypothermia before any rescue could reach them, as few lifeboats made genuine rescue attempts. By the time full daylight arrived several hours later, the surface showed little visible evidence of the catastrophe beyond scattered wreckage. A small flotilla of lifeboats carrying survivors awaited rescue in conditions described as bitterly cold but remarkably calm. Survivors endured several hours awaiting rescue, many wearing only the light clothing they were in when initially roused from sleep. Accounts describe passengers huddling together for warmth, some singing or praying to help maintain morale during this uncertain waiting period. They remained unsure whether rescue would arrive before exposure claimed additional lives, even among those who had successfully escaped the sinking ship. The RMS Carpathia, having received the Titanic's distress signal and immediately altered course toward the reported position, arrived at the disaster site at approximately 4:00 a.m. This was roughly an hour and 40 minutes after the Titanic's final sinking, in the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic. Under the command of Captain Arthur Rostron, the Carpathia had made the considerable journey at genuinely exceptional speed. Rostron ordered the ship's engines pushed well beyond their normal safe operating parameters to reach the survivors as quickly as possible. He simultaneously implemented careful precautionary measures against the same iceberg hazard that had proven fatal to the Titanic. This was a difficult balance between urgency and safety, reflecting exceptional seamanship and leadership under considerable pressure. Over the following several hours, Carpathia's crew worked to recover survivors from the scattered lifeboats, ultimately rescuing 705 people. This was out of the more than 2,200 who had been aboard the Titanic when she departed on her maiden voyage. This left a final death toll estimate at approximately 1,500 people, though some casualty figures remain subject to historical uncertainty. News of the disaster reached the wider world through wireless transmission, even before the Carpathia had completed her rescue operation. Initial reports, complicated by garbled transmission, created painful public confusion and uncertainty regarding the true scope of the tragedy. Some early reports incorrectly suggested the ship had survived, only for the devastating true scale to become clear over the following days. The Carpathia's arrival in New York Harbor several days later, carrying the survivors, drew enormous public attention. Substantial crowds gathered at the dock despite heavy rain, reflecting the immense public fascination and grief the disaster had generated. The news had spread through newspaper coverage and wireless reports, leaving an indelible mark on both American and European society. The Titanic disaster prompted significant, genuinely lasting reform in maritime safety regulation, with formal investigations conducted separately by both British and American governmental bodies, producing detailed recommendations. These recommendations would fundamentally reshape international maritime safety standards for generations to come. The most immediate reform addressed the lifeboat capacity shortfall that had proven so catastrophic during the disaster itself. New international regulations required ships to carry sufficient lifeboat capacity for every person aboard. This definitively closed the regulatory gap that had left the Titanic equipped with barely enough lifeboats for half her capacity. Additional reforms addressed wireless communication protocol, establishing requirements for round-the-clock monitoring aboard passenger vessels. This was directly informed by the communication breakdowns that contributed to the Titanic's failure to heed ice warnings. The disaster also led to the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, an ongoing maritime monitoring program, tracking iceberg positions specifically to help prevent similar future collisions in shipping lanes. This program remarkably continues operating in modified form to the present day, over a century later. The wreck itself remained undiscovered at a depth of 3,800 meters until 1985. A joint American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard finally located the wreckage, providing direct physical evidence. This discovery refined our understanding of how the disaster unfolded during its final catastrophic hours. The Titanic continues to serve as a reminder of human courage and the consequences of institutional overconfidence. These lessons continue protecting countless ocean travelers long after the Titanic slipped beneath the cold waters.